Welcome to the January Agriculture and Forestry Team Call. We are pleased to have with us Dr. Rebecca Phillips to talk about monitoring ecosystem carbon dioxide fluxes under regenerative grazing in North Dakota. Can grazers be used to increase grassland carbon sequestration? First, a little bit about our speaker. Rebecca Phillips is Executive Director of Ecological Insights, a nonprofit carbon research and education corporation, which works primarily with atmospheric carbon dioxide fluxes in grassland ecosystems to determine management effects of carbon sequestration in real time. Rebecca earned a PhD in environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and an MS in rangeland ecology at Colorado State. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan before joining the faculty at the University of North Dakota School of Aerospace to work on carbon dioxide uptake and development of remote sensing-based models for agricultural landscapes. Rebecca continued to work on carbon fluxes in agricultural ecosystems for 8 years at the USDA before moving to New Zealand as research leader for land care research. She returned to the US to live on her small farm and build this applied carbon cycle research program 5 years ago. And now I'll turn it over to Rebecca. Now you need to unmute.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank all of you for coming. I'm really excited to see the interest, and I'm open to, hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions. This project is in collaboration with our rancher who's participating on this project, Lewis Heaton, and Jesse Beckers at the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. He is the administrator of this project and has worked really hard to help get the support that's needed. Can everyone hear me okay? I presume? Okay. I'll start off first with why this work is important, and then touch on the scope of work, range management, and measurements. We'll give you some preliminary results, and then a summary, and then some future directions with methane. Lewis Heaton, the rancher who works with me on this project, is at a conference right now, but he will try to join us here soon so that I can introduce him. So first of all, why this work is important. Rangelands are vanishing at an alarming rate. We know, and these rangelands are really important for a lot of ecosystem services. And we know that rangelands are on the landscape primarily because there are ranchers raising ruminants that convert grasses that people don't eat into meat products for profit. So one of the things that can easily be not what needs to be said, I think sometimes, is that that grasslands and rangelands are privately owned, and the people that usually own them are trying to make money off that. And there's a great pressure to convert these rangelands to corn and soybean, and a lot of financial pressure. So part of this project is hoping that by quantifying the carbon sequestration that occurs every rate, then we might be able to, there might be some value there that can help ranchers to keep their rangelands as rangelands. And it looks like Lewis is here. Hi, Lewis.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. And this project couldn't be done without Lewis and his participation and helping me to put this whole thing together and letting us use his land and his herd. We also have energy companies that are restoring rangelands in western North Dakota, and they're very interested in this work as well, because they'd like to know if what the carbon sequestration rates are and what potential value there could be in their business models. So we have conservationists concerned about the ecosystem services, the wildlife habitat. We have ranchers that would like to see if there might be another stream of income in rangelands via carbon sequestration. And then we have energy companies that are also supporting this project. And currently we just don't know if grazing management can increase carbon sequestration. We're just not, it's not an area that's been really researched. While we know that carbon is sequestered below ground in grasslands in general, the management piece with the grazers is something that there hasn't been as much research on. And so this is a partnership amongst a great number of people, from the Grazing Lands Coalition to National Fish and Wildlife to the Oil and Gas Research Program, North Dakota Petroleum Council, Stockmen's Association. A lot of people would like to know, to understand the numbers behind carbon in rangelands, and see how that might affect their business decisions. So all of us are working on understanding rangeland ecosystem services and values. So we aim to measure carbon dioxide exchange in real time to observe management impacts on plant production and the recovery. So basically, we're working on a working ranch with Lewis's 150 cow-calf pairs on his land in using a regenerative grazing system that he's used for years, that he originally proposed should be looked at for the carbon sequestration element. And just to touch on, for those of you that might not be as familiar on what we mean by net ecosystem uptake of carbon dioxide, we're really talking about removal of carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis. And that's where the plant takes gaseous carbon dioxide from the air and assimilates it into an organic form of carbon in the plant biomass itself. And so most rangeland plant carbon is below ground. And it's important to distinguish that there is a difference between carbon and CO2. In agriculture, we typically talk about carbon because that's the organic carbon, but pipeline CO2 is different, and the measurement or the expression of rates and everything is usually in terms of carbon dioxide versus just the carbon itself. So we basically have two 50-acre pastures that Lewis has helped us use for this project. We have one pasture that is a control that's a half-mile away from another pasture that has what Lewis would call a grazing system. And in this system, we fenced 4 paddocks, each one of them about 11 acres in size, and and each one of these paddocks are grazed at different times of the year. He puts his 150 head cow-calf pair herd there for a day or two, or whatever it takes to remove about 50% of the green leaf area. Then once that is complete, those cattle are moved off the experiment. And then in another time of the year in early summer, they'll graze a different paddock. And then they come back in late summer and they come back in fall. And so this was the sequence in 2023. And in next year, the sequence of when each one of these is grazed will change. So what we're doing is we're letting the animals graze off at least throughout 50% of the leaf area, and we're measuring the carbon dioxide fluxes, and we're tracking the recovery of those grasses in the production that we're measuring, or the photosynthesis that occurs for the days, weeks, and months after that grazing event. So it provides a much more real-time measurement of what our management effects are on the carbon dioxide. This is a picture of one of the units. This is Lewis Heaton here, and the carbon flux measurement unit is over here. We have a rain gauge. We have everything has to be done with solar and batteries for power. we've got a radiometer, soil sensors, air sensors, everything we need to understand the net uptake or loss of CO2 that occurs within each of these pastures. And all of that is the average of those 30-minute increments are put together over the course of a year in order to understand the total amount of CO2 in production that was retained by this ecosystem. And this is the measurement device. It's got a sonic anemometer and an infrared gas analyzer together. And it is measuring at 20 times a second the eddies of air and the concentration of CO2 and water vapor inside those eddies of air. And in addition to those measurements, we're also collecting the standard weather data, that temperature, wind speed, direction, rainfall, humidity, all those things that might also influence the plain old weather variables that might also influence these fluxes. And this is an example of 5 days of data that you might see coming off of this system in terms of the CO2, the net CO2 that is being measured. These are half-hour time points. These data were collected after we had the instrument set up, but before we had any grazing. In the blue is our control pasture, and in the orange is our treatment, our grazed pasture. And what you're seeing here is during the daytime, I'm expressing this as positive. We've got a net positive CO2 uptake. At night, we have a CO2 release. So you could express it the opposite way, but we're doing CO2 uptake as a positive number and release at night as a negative number. And so as long as these uptake numbers are larger than the release, then that means your net over the course of the day is going to be positive, and you've got more carbon moving into your system than is being released. And our goal is to get the annual net ecosystem carbon balance, which is basically our total amount of carbon in production as measured with the CO2, and then how much carbon was deposited as manure by the animals, and how much carbon was exported or harvested in grazed biomass by the animals. And an example of this is of a net ecosystem carbon balance work was done by colleagues about 30 miles away from me, and they did use this technique in order to look at 3 years of crops in a crop field. They had that same instrument set up in the field that 1 year was wheat, 1 year corn, and 1 year soybean. And this was a no-till system, and they measured the production, which is the NEP here, and then they measured how much in grain was removed from that system. And what they found out was the net ecosystem carbon balance in this case was negative in this crop field, because by the time you take into account the harvest, you end up you're not really gaining carbon in the system because you're taking off most or more than what you would have taken in. So that is an example of why it's so important to look at the whole year and the net ecosystem carbon balance rather than just during the summer when plants are growing well. So that's just one example in a crop field. We're going to do something similar, only in this graze system. And this is a picture of what it looks like out there with the animals grazing nearby the instruments. We were very anxious about how well the cattle were going to behave in light of the expense of the instruments, but everything went really well. We had to put out tanks for them and water and put hoses out there to make sure they had plenty of water. The 150 cow-calf pairs ranged from a day to 2 days in time of how long we kept them out there. Grazers are influenced by a lot of different things, and they don't always graze the same all the time. And our leaf area removal ranged from somewhere between 0.3 to 0.5, so roughly 30 to 50%. Most of the time we were closer to 50%. in terms of how much grass was removed during these events. This was our first year. This is an example of what it looked like after they grazed, compared to the over the fence there, an area where they hadn't grazed. We also collected data in the field in order to measure the true leaf area and the amount of grass that was removed, by clipping before and after each grazing event. And this is the same type of graph I showed you before, only this is 60 days after the initial grazing event. And this is 4 days of time where you're seeing the blue line is the control, the orange line is the grazed area. And now, 2 months later, we were starting to see that there's a bit of a difference showing up during the day when plants are photosynthesizing the most, and the orange line or the grazed area being slightly higher than the control, just a minor difference between the two. But this is why we have to take so much data, because we have to consider all kinds of different conditions, sunlight and everything that influence these numbers. And this is 100 days post-grazing, and this is just 2 days of raw data, but now we're seeing that the difference between the grazed and the ungrazed is a little bit more pronounced, because that vegetation is regrowing, has regrown to a large extent. The leaf area has been restored. We've got grass recovery here. And that's also corroborated by the amount of green biomass that was measured. Let's see here. What the we have each one of these points is a month, and you can see that while most of the green biomass was similar in the early parts of the summer, as we get into August and September, the grazed areas has more green grass, because that recovery has occurred and the grasses are photosynthesizing more. There's more grass swards apparently, and slightly more pounds per acre, which would help compensate for the amount of grass that was removed by the grazers. And this is the leaf area number, which you can see also is not too far from the biomass number. Leaf area is an important measure often used with these models to estimate carbon fluxes, because we need to have leaf area in order to photosynthesize. So that kind of summarizes some of our preliminary results and what things are looking like. We didn't know what we were going to find until we started here. I could summarize what we know so far and give you a quick look at what we're hoping to get into in the future with methane. First of all, we observed an increase in production in the net uptake of CO2 for grazed pasture later in the growing season. But we can't really say anything conclusive until we have a full year of data and we went through everything to determine the net ecosystem carbon balance. Once we know for both pastures the total amount of production as the amount of carbon that was retained by that system, plus what was deposited, minus what was harvested, then that balance will be very informative on how that grazing may have affected production and the overall annual rate of carbon sequestration. And then finally, I wanted to just touch on what we're hoping to be able to do to add to this, because we're so well positioned with our instruments, would be to look at the methane fluxes as well, because there's some evidence on an animal basis that you can optimize grazing to minimize methane emissions. Now I don't know how I can't tell you the full scope of this study, but it's a review that says that there's a relationship there between methane and the way that emissions and the way that they're grazed. The details I couldn't tell you right this moment, but my specialty has always been in the methane consumption by the soil. So, and one of the things that we've lacked in research is an ecosystem level 50-acre or pasture type measurement for this methane flux. And so what we have in the soil are actually microbes that CH4 is the methane that literally consume the methane in order for energy. And that's part of the equation when we talk about grazers, animal production, and methane that isn't always touched on. And so because these methane consumers are increase their methane consumption rate as you give them more methane, it's always been a question in my mind, if grazers, how grazers influence that methane consumption, and is there any substantive offset to that in the whole methane story? And really, we haven't had the measurements to be able to really do that. We can stick animals in a box and measure how much, so to speak, and measure how much methane they produce, give them different things to eat, but to actually have them out in a rangeland ecosystem, measuring what's really happening in the atmosphere with the methane is not something we've been able to achieve until now or this year. This is a picture of our current system, and this is what it looks like in the jaws of the unit, as Lewis likes to say, where the measurements are being collected, and then what we're hoping to do is to be able to literally add an intake to our existing system if we can get this methane analyzer that would allow us to literally collect that methane flux data in addition to the carbon dioxide flux data in the same way, so that we could at least address that question, whether or not these pastures in their methane uptake or release vary. So that's be an exciting new development with a new product that is able to detect these really small concentrations that'll be coming out later this year. So I wanted to make sure that I also touched on what I call the human element of this all, and some ranchers that use these management systems and look at these environmental issues and carbon, tell me, that they feel like they're doing something good for the land, the cattle, the consumer. One told me it makes him feel good about ranching in general, and that they could feel proud of doing something that's good for the long-term sustainability. And this is Jed Ryder, one of our participating ranchers, and I put a weather station on his ranch where we're collecting leaf area and other weather data, so that we'll be able to scale up and maybe model his area as well once we finish collecting everything with the more intensive site here at the Heaton Ranch. And so I wanted to, I didn't want to overwhelm you with too much data or anything, but I wanted to give you plenty of room for questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. There are a couple of questions here from John Porterfield. Will measuring soil respiration be helpful to this research?
Well, that's what we are doing when we get these fluxes. What ends up happening in the end is we partition them into gross primary production and respiration. So at the end, when we get the full year, at least a full year of data, we'll be able to, those nighttime measurements are actual respiration measurements, and that all of those exact details will be partitioned more explicitly when we finish the full year of data. So respiration's included in this for sure.
Great. Raj Pataka, any general observations on carbon production with respect to precipitation events?
Well, this is there's precipitation, I would say, tends to stimulate, depending on conditions, some amount of respiration. These systems do not measure carbon dioxide flux very well in a rainstorm. So if you wanted to find out what was going on during the rain, these systems can't, in the way that they work, they can't do that. But after a rain, we can certainly see increases in grass production, and we can also see increases in respiration both. Yeah.
He also asks, any general observations on carbon production in the growth of species and carbon production in grazed areas, i.e. animal grazing their favorite plants versus less favored species?
That would be, that's not something that I was able to track. I'm afraid the species selection I agree, is important. We're hoping to get more collaborators to help us out with more details like you're suggesting. It's a good question, to be able to identify what they're selecting and if that's influencing, the carbon dioxide fluxes too.
Great. From North Dakota Senator Tim Mathern, welcome. Is there a role for government in supporting this work?
I'd say absolutely. I forgot to say, at the very end, support's always welcome. But yeah, it's I mean, a lot of the support's been coming from the state, and the industrial commission has a 1-to-1 match. So but it can't be matched from the state. So they provided a great deal of funding for this work, but so then we have support from the National Fish and Wildlife, and from like Hess Oil, which is now Chevron, provided some funds. So those are the kinds of ways we try to find a way to find the match. I'd like to see more USDA funding, but we're just going to have to take some time to explore that.
And from Ken Skog, it seems the greater global warming potential of methane emissions versus CO2 could easily offset the carbon uptake benefit with grazing. How would this not be the case?
I understand completely what you're saying, and it is true that the greater global warming potential of methane is important. And part of the reason that I don't really get into those details here is because it can get very complicated depending on what the scope is and scale you're really talking about. In this case, we've got where do you want the methane emissions to start and stop within the animal, in the life cycle of the animal? So we've got in a paper. So if it, do you want to talk about just that growing season? Do you want to talk about when it goes to a feedlot? It can get real complicated real fast, but in the paper that I published with my colleagues in New Zealand, where we were using dairy cattle and doing paddock grazing, we did have some methane estimates that were from measurements from one of my colleagues. And during that time frame of the experiment, the methane emissions offset some of those carbon gains, but not completely. So I think it depends on where the timing that you're considering. If and when we get down to the full year and we take a look at, here's the animals and here's the amount of methane expected to be produced by those animals, we can include them in the budget, and we can say, okay, we would expect that the methane emissions during this year, when we were doing these measurements while these animals were here, this is what they would be. But it doesn't completely necessarily overshadow the carbon gains, depending on how substantive those gains are.
Well, and also you're talking about methane uptake by the soil, and all those, a lot of measurements don't take that into account.
Right. And I just feel like that's an important piece that maybe it's not that important, but we haven't done the measurement yet. And
Yeah.
and until we do, we can't really say for certain what that methane budget is, including the consumption when they're there too.
Okay. Matt Myers, are you correlating your data to soil carbon measurements? Would that be useful?
Yes, the soil carbon measurements were done prior to beginning this experiment, and we plan to do additional soil carbon measurements if we can keep this project going beyond a couple of years. But it usually takes close to 5 years using standard methods to be able to see that difference in carbon in the ground. So it's a nice measure, but it just takes it just takes a while before you're going to see that detectable levels of organic carbon in the soil, as far as we know. So it'll be a nice supplement. Like if we could keep this going for 5 years, and I could see, okay, 5 years later I can do similar soil sampling, but we're not that the soil carbon is not the same as what we're talking about with the carbon dioxide flux. The because the carbon dioxide flux is including the carbon that went into the mycorrhizae, the carbon that went into the roots that are often very difficult to measure in soil sampling, the carbon, the exudates that came out of that carbon, the all those organisms that the carbon went into in the ground that are very, very difficult to measure, that this kind of a system is taking into account. Even the litter that's left on the ground, or the duff, I mean, crowns from plants that remained. It's a complicated budget, but it that's why we say it's net, because anything that is using or taking up carbon or releasing carbon is all included in that measurement.
Okay. Where does this from Benjamin Nagy? Where does this research fit into the larger body of research on regenerative grazing? Does this research serve more to determine the value of regenerative grazing, or more to identify optimal methods for regenerative grazing, etc.?
I think if I understand this correctly, that this is basically testing, in my mind, for the possibly for the first time, how regenerative grazing influences the carbon cycle, influences at least the net carbon uptake, let's say, or net carbon fluxes. It's this kind of grazing system where you've actually got real animals on a working ranch grazing and collecting all that carbon dioxide data for the whole system. That's kind of new ground. So I think the ranchers have been telling us for years that they're regenerating their ground. We're putting the numbers behind it now in a way that hasn't been done before.
Okay. Pam asks, I had read that seaweed feed can be shown to decrease methane from cattle. Could you talk about that?
I wish I could. I haven't taken the time to research that in as I probably should have, but yeah, I think that came out of the Southern Hemisphere, some of those dietary modifications. But I couldn't talk specifics about how that influences the rumen and the production of methane.
That's fine. Matt Myers again. It looks like you are comparing a regenerative grazing protocol to an ungrazed control. Will you also be comparing your system to a non-regenerative system of grazing?
That would be great, wouldn't it? Yeah, we'd love to add that to, a season long, for example, rangeland, to be able to and who knows, maybe if the modeling exercises and the work well, we might come close to identifying that if we modeled areas nearby that are season long over time, we might be able to get at least an indication of what the difference is, and then follow that up with measurements.
Okay, Reed Hamilton, does your instrument distribution account for variations in leaf count across a given paddock that could affect grazing impact?
We're doing leaf area, literally scanning, separating the green material and scanning each leaf for the area, so that if there's a certain amount of leaf area before grazing and after grazing, we're not counting the leaves right yet, but we are getting an expression in square centimeters of leaf area per square centimeters of ground, which in most cases has been sufficient.
Ken Skog asks, is it practical to collect manure and contain methane, or is the main methane directly from the animal's digestion?
Yeah, manure is a source of methane. There's no doubt about it. I would say it's more pronounced from the digestion, I would think. But we are getting the respiration from the manure, the CO2 that's emitted. It emits a lot of CO2 from manure. And if we got this methane sensor, we would be able to pick up the methane that's being emitted from the manure. Most of the methane comes from the animal's mouth, and it would be interesting to see if that excess methane from the mouth is diffusing into the ground and into those organisms that are consuming it. But yeah, it's possible to do those measurements.
Yeah, and it seems to me that most of what comes from manure out on rangeland is going to be CO2 and not methane, because they're not under anaerobic conditions, unlike in a manure lagoon.
That's true. It's not like a manure lagoon, and the microsites of anaerobic microsites would probably be very small and maybe not that substantive in the manure, unless there's a massive rain event. Yeah.
Matt Myers again. Do the cattle graze slash trample the 11-ish acre paddocks fairly uniformly over the course of a day or two, or are they preferring to stay in certain areas?
Well, when we first started, the first time, this has been a learning experience. We found that they were clumping a little bit more than we wanted them to. And I was new to the pasture. The instruments were new. They weren't real happy with me or what was going on. It affected, how they moved. And then we got Alan, a herdsman, to come out in subsequent grazing events and literally with an ATV push them around, push them around, push them around. And then when I was the one that put the hose out there to give them water, then they liked me okay.
Okay. If I didn't get to your question, I think I've covered all of them except for the comments with links, which I hope people will look at. But I don't see any more questions. Does anyone else have a question? You can just unmute and ask the question.
I have a question about measurement of beef output per unit. Is that something that will happen at the end of a year study, or when does that when's that come into consideration?
When you say beef output per unit, can you explain?
Well, in other words, your study is about gas fluxes, but is there a component that measures production of beef from this particular area?
That's a great question, and I'm going to have to talk to Lewis. He may have had to jet off to his conference, but yeah, we can definitely. It wouldn't be surprising if he's got those data about beef production and what the gains were there. But I'll have to ask him to be sure.
Am I allowed to ask another question? I asked too many, maybe already, Nancy. What do you think?
We have plenty of time. Go ahead, Matt.
I have been under the impression in the past, I'm not a rancher, but I've, read about the topic a little bit, and it sounds like maybe your stocking density is a little bit lower than what you sometimes see for regenerative grazing. Is that true, or am I just calculating wrong?
Are there any ranchers here, Gene or Chad, that can speak to that? Are you still here?
Okay, yes, I just muted back on. Yes, it's just a function of time and timing where animals are when and for how long, whether they're concentrated in, say, 500,000 pounds per acre or spread out. It's just a function of, then it's a function of time. And it's probably more related to, I have to think here so I can express what I do. It's probably more related to the bite the animal takes, and when that plant starts regenerating new regrowth, so the animal is gone before they have a chance to take a second or a third bite. More so than time. There's multiple factors related to just time alone, or concentrating them in a small area. It's also, and that changes daily or weekly, how much moisture you have, temperature, sunlight. This last season here in 23, we had a lot of smoke, Canadian and Western smoke, and that forest fire smoke, and that affected also affected the animals' behavior because they were getting a little extra stress from another source. So there's multiple factors. I can't give any one specific, but yes, cross fencing. My background, I started cross fencing in 1980. So I have 23, I have 44 years of background in cross fencing, rotational grazing. And you asked me if I could go back to season long, never. But the multiple benefits of, and how much time can I afford to spend out there? Can I do multiple moves per day? Lewis Heaton, I know him. I know Dr. Phillips. It's also a concentration of how much time you have available. And I concentrate more on lately here, looking at breaking seasonal plant growth into trimesters. The first trimester would be where the plant has to borrow some stored energy in order to grow and initiate growth. And where does the point where that plant is already put back what it had to borrow to grow? And then the second trimester, I look at the vegetative state where it's oozing exudates, sugars in out of their roots. And the third trimester would be where they're transitioning to and reproduction, where they're gathering it back in and no longer oozing sugars feeding the soil. So I look at, say, that 50% maximum plant removal, leaf removal, and maximizing leaf area, so I can get a longer season of that second trimester. And also looking at where you had the crop removal, the cover crops, following the main crop removal or companion cropping, to extend the number of days of harvesting sunlight, feeding sugars into the soil. There's a lot more complicated than that. Dr. Phillips is way more on that than I ever will be, because I'm just a producer out here trying to observe what's happening. What am I seeing? But definitely, think of hopefully Dr. Phillips would support me on this of extending the number of days of exuding sugars into the soil from the plant roots.
Absolutely.
Exudates. I'm calling it sugars, but exudates. The roots are oozing, exudating sugars.
Yeah, it's interesting that Gene is just one of the godfathers, in my opinion, of regenerative grazing, and it's just interesting that in October, when the leaf area was very similar, we were still seeing slightly greater CO2 uptake in these ecosystems. That made me go, wow, what are they're not putting that extra carbon to above ground growth. So like Gene was saying, maybe these grazed grasses in their regenerative phase is putting more sugars below ground. We don't know that for certain. We'd love to test that. We'd love to have a graduate student come on and and work with me on it. But there's so many physiological things that some people have observed, like Gene, that could be going on, that we could get more quantitative if we wanted. Did that answer your question?
Sort of. I was just wondering where you all fall in kind of the general range of people doing regenerative agriculture in terms of stocking density, but it sounds like it's a lot more complicated than that.
I wish it was like oh yeah, everybody does this, right? Yeah.
Good. Anyone else?
It's a journey, not a destination. I feel I'll never get there. And the further I go, the more I see how little I know.
Yeah, but progress all along the way.
That's right. So if Lewis was here, he would be saying that he's hoping that there's he does a lot of work with the carbon buyers, and he's starting to see people giving extra carbon credits, if you will, or carbon value for these systems that could be storing more carbon every year. They don't have the numbers, as far as I know, for the exact, how much more they should be paying for regenerative grazing pastures, but he's seeing that they're asking for these data, and they want to know, and they'd like to be able to pay a premium for these practices. So I thought that was encouraging. But he sees that as the economics of this is something that if there's an extra $50 an acre or something somehow that a range manager could get, for this extra work that he does for these kinds of practices, it might help push them to help them continue to do this, and not just say, well, I'll rent it out to the big farmer who's turning everything to corn, right?
There is excuse me, there is a definite change in SOM, or soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, whatever terms you want to use. But it gets to be more stable at a given, say 0 to 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 40. But we're enhancing rooting depth. And then it starts changing. I believe it would be a term, exponential change, because you're starting to enhance rooting depth and forming organics, or forming or aggregate structure and glomalin. There's so many different factors that probably I think we know more about outer space than we know what's under our feet.
You're probably right. Yes, Rita.
Will you be publishing at the end of your 1-year study your results?
Yeah, I'm planning to write up the full manuscript based on 1 year of data, even though some journals would prefer more years. I think it's going to be a strong enough paper that we will certainly hope to get that published hopefully by the end of next year if we can, because we think that it's important to get this kind of work out there. But yeah, it's all going to be in a peer-reviewed manuscript. Yeah.
Excellent.
Anyone else?
Okay, I have one more. Sorry. kind of piggybacking on something Reed said earlier about the amount of harvestable beef you get off of the land, but relating that to the potential for carbon credits that you mentioned earlier. And I'm not sure if the carbon credit thing is something that you've really dug into much, or if it was your colleague that you were saying was more in that, but it does seem like as carbon markets become more sophisticated and are subjecting suppliers of carbon credits to greater scrutiny, they're probably going to want to know exactly what Reed was asking. How much carbon are you sequestering per pound of beef, say? Not just what's happening on the land, because if let's say you're doing regenerative grazing, but your beeves are growing slower, then that brings back it reduces the positive effect that you're having, I guess, is what I would say, because you're not able to supply the market as deeply with that product. You see what I mean?
That is a great point. That is a great point. Several of these calves that were just born last May that grazed out there, Lewis just sold a good chunk of them, so he's got a pretty good idea of how much they gained and all that. And I love that idea of how much carbon sequestered per pound of beef. That's a great idea. We just need to get those numbers. Yeah.
And if I suddenly disappear, I'm going to be rude, but we're in the middle of a storm, and I think my lights have been flickering. So
Okay, no
if that
problem.
happens, I'm not
Yeah,
I'm not
thank you
being
for
rude.
attending. Yeah.
Rather than looking at, say, pounds of how heavy that calf is on comes off that cow, I've been tracking more the last 35 years or so, how many pounds of beef raised per acre versus how much performance per cow. And then it gets to be a lot easier tracking.
Pounds of beef per acre?
Yes.
Okay.
Pounds of calf per acre versus and I just completed again another season here, or average, say, May 15th to June 15th, calves coming in. I do custom grazing with cow calf pairs. From subtract birth weight to then the weight gained to sale was average 2.6 pounds per day, average daily gain.
Okay.
And on the cover crop grazing after grain harvest, October, November into December, we were getting a little over 3 pounds per day average daily gain in the calves. So it's fairly easy to get the average pounds of beef produced per acre. Some of us, I'm sure Jed Ryder, Lewis Heaton, among others, that where we keep track of each other, we're pretty much doing the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, that's something that I know the beef producers that are focused on grazing in my area they're focusing more on the pounds of beef per acre rather than the production per animal unit, because very often especially when you're grazing, if you actually are trying to produce or just focusing on pounds per animal, you actually get relatively inefficient production. The animals just aren't able to necessarily perform at the level that they will in a grazing situation that you get when you're using smaller animals.
I'm thinking here of from charting and tracking production from 1980 on, when I started when I was season-long grazing days, we've enhanced about 450% per acre forage production compared to what we used to have before. And they refuse to we'll cap it at 300% or 300, harvesting 300%, and we're leaving 150% more behind than we used to raise total before. Feed the soil first, feed the animal second. The animal is just a tool for soil health enhancement.
That seems like a really useful way to think about the whole thing, because I live in a ranching area too, and talking to ranchers here about modifying their grazing, they're not going to be too concerned about greenhouse gas fluxes, but if they can be shown that their pounds per acre is going to improve and that they're going to contribute to mitigating climate change, that's a much better sell.
And yes, I'm probably putting too much input in here, but I view it as the work of the Dr. Phillips is that the science is a tool for my art of management. It's rubbing elbows together.
That's the ideal.
One other thing too about focusing on that soil health, that ranchers and egg producers do have to focus on what's happening in terms of the climate, in terms of how well they're able to deal with things like drought, how well they're able to absorb the water that comes with precipitation and hold on to that. And so in that sense, that's something that really changes your ability to make a profit. If you're able to get additional organic matter into that soil, then that means that you're more resilient against both drought and flooding. And those are things that really have a negative effect on egg producers. So egg producers do care about those things. Whatever they think about the global climate, they have to worry about what's happening in their field.
Yep.
Great point. Thank you.
Okay. We are just about 1 minute till the top of the hour. So this has been really wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, everyone who showed up and all of your great questions. So have a good rest of your morning or afternoon, whichever you're in.
Thank you.
No,
That was
thank
a
you very
great,
much,
great
everyone.
talk.
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you for coming, and I loved all the questions. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you.
Right.
Thanks,
End the
Rebecca.
meeting.